I'm going to show you how to build a Kotlin Multiplatform Project that includes an Android application, a front-end or a website, and the back-end or the REST API. So here we have an API that will actually provide the data, or in this case a couple of different person objects, based on which number of person objects we request through a count parameter of our API. As you can see from our website here, we can type, for example, number 3, click fetch, and we are going to receive here 3 different person objects. So we can type here number 2, number 5 or 4 and so on. If we type here -1, then we're going to receive here an error. And that same goes with our Android application, okay? So here we can type number 2, fetch, number 3, fetch, or we can type here -1, and we are going to receive here an error as well. To create a Kotlin multi-platform project, I'm going to use one framework which is called a Kobweb that will allow us to set up the environment for our front end and the back end as well. So be sure to watch this video until the end if you want to learn how to create a multi-platform project with Kotlin. Now, we're going to create this Kotlin multi-platform project from scratch. However, I'm not going to focus too much on explaining what a Kobweb is, how it works, how to install a Kobweb binary on your PC and other information, because I have already covered those basic information in a couple of my previous videos, so I highly suggest you to check those videos before you continue watching this one. Anyhow, now let's open up the CMD, so that we can actually generate an empty Kobweb project template that we are going to use to start working on our Kotlin multi-platform project. So the first thing, I'm going to navigate to a directory in my partition, which is called a Kobweb. And inside this directory, I'm going to create that new template. So let's here call a command Kobweb create to create a new project template. So I'm going to choose here an empty project template, so select this one and press enter. The name of my project will be a Kotlin multi-platform demo. Just type here the same name, there you go. Now let's specify a group ID to be, for example, com.example. Maybe let's say KMP demo, press enter. Now we have a question here whether we want to use a Silk UI layer which is built on top of the Compose for Web. So this is used for the front end, just type yes. Now the question is whether we want to include a support for defining a server behavior. Type here yes, because we are going to need this feature to actually build our backend server, so press yes. I'm not going to use Markdown for now, so just type here no. I'm going to initialize here a Git, so press yes. Initial commit yes, and initial commit message as well. Press enter. And now our project has been successfully generated. Now we can close that and we can open up this project in Android Studio. So far I have used a Kobweb project inside the IntelliJ IDE, but since this will be a Kotlin multi-platform project, I'm going to use a Android Studio instead. So let's open up now our new project, so D, then a Kobweb, and here this is our Kobweb multi-platform demo. So just select this one and press OK. Let's open it up in a new window actually, so new window, perfect. Now the first thing that we're going to do here, we're going to add a dependency for a Kotlin X serialization library, because that library will be needed to actually serialize and deserialize model classes or objects that we're going to send from our server to our frontend and our Android application. Now each and every Kobweb template here contains a version catalog, which is basically one file in which you can declare all your dependencies and the plugins. Just select here do not show again, nevertheless. And before we start, let me introduce you with this project structure for a moment. So by default, this empty project template contains a site module, which contains 2 or 3 different source sets, like the JS main and the JVM main. The third one is a common main, but in this case I haven't defined that right now. So this JVM main is used to basically define our backend server, and the JS main is used to define our front end or our actual website. So as you can see here, we can open it up. We have some components directory and the pages directory. We can remove those default README files from here, so just delete them, we don't need them at this point. And of course, first we're going to start with our JVM main. So first we're going to start with our backend server. Now also let's here press shift 2 times to open up TOML files, so libs.versions.toml. This one represents a version catalog file, and here we have all versions, libraries, and the plugins that we have defined. Now I'm going to here just copy and paste one dependency and a plugin for a Kotlin X serialization library. And I'm going to also define here a Kotlin X version to be 1.5.1. So that's the current version of a Kotlin X serialization library. I'm going to now here just paste one dependency for a Kotlin X serialization. So there you go. This is that actual dependency, and the actual version is grabbed from this value right here. And also I'm going to declare here one plugin as well. So a serialization plugin, so that's the actual string value, and the version for this plugin is actually the version of our Kotlin and not the Kotlin X, okay? So be sure to remember that. Now let's sync the project. I'm going to also open up the Gradle build file of our site module that holds those two source sets like the JS main and the JVM main. So here, as you can see, we can see now all those plugins that are actually declared within our site module, like the Kotlin Multiplatform, JetBrains Compose, and the Kobweb application as well. So this site module represents our actual Kobweb application. We don't need this markdown at all, so I'm going to just remove that one. And from here as well. So now, as you can see here, we have 3 different source sets: common main, JS main, and the JVM main. And each one of them contain different kind of dependencies, right? So here we have some kind of an error, which is why I'm going to open up the project level Gradle build file, and here I'm going to define plugins section as well. So just copy all those plugins from here, paste that right there, and click sync now. I'm going to also add here a Google and Maven repository. So now in our Gradle build file of our site module, I'm going to add one more dependency in our JVM main. And that dependency will be our actual Kotlin X serialization. So just type here Kotlin X serialization. That's the actual dependency that we have just added right here. And also we need to apply a serialization plugin on top of our file as well. So just here specify serialization.plugin. There you go. Click sync now. And now that we have added this Kotlin X serialization, now we can create some model classes that we're going to reuse across our Kotlin Multiplatform project. And in order to reuse those model classes, we're going to need to create here a new module in our application. And that new module will be called a common. So I'm going to just select this whole site module, press Ctrl C to copy this whole module. I'm going to now select this root directory and press Ctrl V to paste this same module. I'm going to just rename this module to say common. So just press OK. We can also select this don't ask again, and we want to add all those files to Git. So just press add. There you go. And now we have a new module which is called common. So from this common module Gradle build file, we need to change a few things. So this common module will represent a Kobweb library and not the Kobweb application. So let's here specify a Kobweb.library. We can remove this Kobweb block from here. And instead of this import right there, I'm going to use a different import for a different function, which is called config as a Kobweb library. So just go down below and replace this config as a Kobweb application and replace that with a new one. I'm going to remove this first parameter from here. I'm going to remove this first import. Let's just scroll down below to see if we need anything more to add. So for now, I think that would be all. Just sync the project now. And if you are seeing this warning here that says code inside unavailable, it means that we need to open up the project level Gradle build file, so this one, and we need to add here a plugins section or a block. So just specify here a new plugins block, and here I'm going to paste those plugins, like the Multiplatform, Compose, Kobweb library, and the serialization as well. So just paste that and press sync now. There we go. So now that the warning will disappear, we can close that one. And now within our common module, we are going to have a JS main and a JVM main source sets. However, I'm going to remove everything from this JS main, so all those files and directories. And from here, I'm going to remove everything as well. So we don't need that anymore in our common module. And here in our common module, I'm going to create a new source set. So just press here, select this JS main and press Ctrl C, select the source file and press Ctrl V, and here we're going to paste a new module or a new source set with the name of a common main. Press OK. We can also just remove this resource directory because we don't need it at this point. I'm going to open up the Gradle file of our common module, and I'm going to add here also this Kotlin X serialization library in our common main. So now sync the project, and if you're still seeing this code inside unavailable information message, then you need to open up the settings Gradle file, and here we need to include one more module which is now called a common. Okay, so now let's sync the project, and now we should be able to remove that info message in our common Gradle file. There we go. So now everything here seems to work just fine. Just close that for now. Perfect. And finally, in our common module, I'm going to create now that model class that I have talked about earlier. So in our common main source set, let's here create a new Kotlin file with the name of person. So this person will be just a simple data class that will contain two properties, name of a string type and the age of an integer type. So here, if you're seeing this message, that means that we need to rename our actual package name not to have a uppercase letters. So just select this uppercase letters part and press Alt plus Enter. Let's rename that in all directories. And we can now rename that to say KMP demo with the lowercase letters. Press refactor. And there we go. So now it will work just fine. We can also try and do the same thing in our site module as well. So apparently, let me just see. Okay, so here we have lowercase letters. Okay, so that's fine. All right, so now after that, we need to also annotate this person model class with a serializable annotation, because this person class will be serialized whenever we are sending this person object from our backend server to our frontend and our Android application. Now the second model class that I'm going to create here and that will be reused across multiple different modules in our Kotlin Multiplatform will be API response. So this will be actually a sealed class, so API response. And this sealed class will have three different child classes. The first one will be object with the name of idle. Let's implement this API response. The second one will be a data class actually, because it will hold some data. It will be named success. It will hold the data of a type of a list of a person objects. Let's just implement here API response class. And the third one will be named error, and it will hold only one simple value, which will be named the error message of a string type only. Now we also need to annotate this class with a serializable annotation, but also all its children elements or classes needs to have that same annotation as well. So just apply this serializable annotation right there. And also those three classes needs to have one more annotation, which is called a serial name. And here we need to specify a lowercase letter idle, a lowercase letter success, and a lowercase letter error. So now we have those two common classes that will be reused across multiple different modules. So basically with this we have completed everything we needed for our common module. Now we can close that. We can close this class and this one from here. And now I'm going to open up actually our site module. So let's open up here our JVM main, and in our API directory I'm going to create the new file that will represent our first endpoint. So that endpoint will be used to actually fetch some data from the front end and from our Android application. So let's create here the file with the name of getPeople. So the name of this file is important because the name of this file will be used as a name of our endpoint. So here I'm going to now paste actually some code, and then I'm going to explain. Okay, so now in this Kotlin file, the person and the API response are not actually recognized, which means that in our site Gradle file, we need to go down below, and in our JVM main, we need to implement here our common module so that we can actually access those model classes. So just write here implementation, project, and the actual name of our module, so common. Now sync the project, and those classes are now actually available in our source set. So import both of those classes. Perfect. And for a brief moment, I'm going to now explain you what this Kotlin files contains and how it will work. So here we have one function which is called getPeople, and this function represents the actual endpoint that will be used to actually fetch some data. Here I have hard-coded a couple of different person objects that we're going to use to send to our users whenever someone sends here a GET request. Now, each new endpoint that you create in a JVM main needs to be located in this API directory. Now, each function that contains a suspend keyword, an API annotation, and this API context parameter is recognized as an API endpoint. You can also add here one parameter which is called a route override if you want to change the name of your API endpoint. In this case, by default, this API function here will have a name of a getPeople because it's located in this same directory or this file. So now let me briefly introduce you with this logic inside this function. So as you can see from here, we are using this same context to access some of those properties like the request and the response. From the request, we are receiving some data like the actual parameters from that GET request. And here we have specified the exact same key of that parameter from which we want to extract a value. In this case, each value is extracted as a string value, and we are basically converting that string into an integer value so that we can use that integer value to decide how many person objects we want to send back to that person which has sent that GET request. Now here we are using now a response property to actually send back that response and encode this actual API response success object into a JSON string. And we are basically encoding this whole object into a JSON string so that we can send back that data to our users. And of course, if something bad happens, we are encoding this API response error object into a string and sending back that actual object back to our users. So that's how our backend will work. So it's quite simple. So we have only one endpoint which basically provides some data that we have hard-coded in this case. And now that we have created all of that, now we can actually test it out and see whether this endpoint actually works. So let's open up the terminal here. I'm going to navigate to this site module, so cd site, and from this module we can now call this Kobweb run function to run our Kobweb server. Just wait a little bit until this server is started, and then we will be able to access this same server on a local host. This Kobweb server is actually a Ktor server in the background, so just so you know. Okay, so now we have received one error that says that our home page is defined under the package of KMP demo, but must exist under the uppercase letters. So we have actually changed this name, which is why we need to modify our Gradle file. So let's first open up the Gradle file of our site module, and here let's rename this group ID to say KMP demo with the lowercase letters. Let's now sync the project. I'm going to open up also this common Gradle file and replace that with a new name as well. Sync the project once again. And now I think that we should be able to start our server successfully. Open up the terminal. And now our server is up and running. So let's open up the local host in our web browser. Let's just wait until this is actually built successfully. Okay, so now if we check the inspect panel, you will see that in the console we have a message that says hello world, and that the same message is available within our index page of the JS main in the site directory. Okay, so here we are just printing a simple hello world message, which means that our page on the front end actually works. But now let's try to actually access this endpoint, which is called getPeople. Now, this get people endpoint is of course all in a lowercase letters, so be sure to remember that. Anyhow, I'm going to now here type /API because our endpoint is actually located in the API directory. So right there, as you can see in the JVM main, we have an API directory, and only inside that directory we have our endpoint. So type here, let's say get people, and then the question mark, and the actual parameter with the name of account equal to, let's say, maybe number 2. So now if I press enter, then you're going to see that we have successfully fetched 2 different person objects from our API, okay? So type success, and the data is of course those 2 person objects. So here if I now specify count number 1, then we're going to fetch only 1 person object. If I specify here number 5, for example, we're going to fetch that same object, or a different kind of number of those objects. And if I here type some number that is actually greater than the person objects that we actually have in our list, for example number 10, then we are going to fetch basically all of those person objects without a problem. However, if I type here something else, like maybe let's say -1, then we are going to receive here a different type, which is error, and it will contain the error message which says requested element count -1 is less than 0. So basically our API endpoint works perfectly fine. So we have now successfully handled our backend server. So the next thing, we need to handle our front end, or this JS main. So basically this JS main contains this index Kotlin file, which is located in this pages directory, and every file that is located and actually named as an index represents a main page in that specific directory. In this case, this index page will be available whenever we open up the root of our website. And here, as you can see, we have a simple composable function with the name of a home page. Now, each and every composable function which has a page annotation means that that composable function represents a whole page on our website, okay? We can also pass here a route override parameter so that we can actually rename how our page will be called. Anyhow, I'm going to just leave that as it is for this home page. So now in our home page, I'm going to declare a couple of different UI components, and I'm going to basically add one input field that will allow us to specify how many person objects we want to retrieve from our backend, and one button that will basically trigger the logic to actually send that GET request. So the first thing I'm going to add here one column. So let's create here one simple column composable function. I'm going to add here first one modifier. So I'm going to add here a fill maximum size, and I'm going to add here a margin on the top to be, let's say, maybe 200 pixels. So this modifier is actually not the same as the modifier in Jetpack Compose with Android, because it contains some other different parameters or functions that are available only with the CSS, because at the end of the day, Kobweb is actually a framework which translates this Kotlin code into HTML, CSS and JavaScript. So I'm going to also add here one more parameter, which is a horizontal alignment. So I want to align here all its children elements on the center horizontally. And now within this column, I'm going to add first one span text. So here as a text, I'm going to specify and say how many people you want to get. So simple as that. I'm going to add here also one modifier. I'm going to here specify the margin on the bottom to be maybe around 8 pixels. I'm going to here specify a font family to be Roboto. I'm going to now here specify the font size to be 18 pixels, and the font weight to be, let's say, font weight.medium. Okay, so that's our first text, and below this text I'm going to add here one simple input field. So let's here call input composable function, which will basically translate to a HTML input element on our page. So let's here specify a couple of different parameters, like the actual type of this field. So input type dot number. I'm going to add here a modifier. In this case, this composable function contains the attribute parameter, but we can convert that into a modifier quite easily. So something like that. We are using a modifier, and then we are converting that back to attributes. So here I'm going to now specify a margin on the bottom to be around the 16 pixels. I'm going to add here, of course, the font family, the font size, and those same parameters from above as well. The font size here will be a little bit lower, so 16 pixels, or actually 14. And I'm going to add here one custom attribute. So I'm going to call here the attribute function and specify the name of this attribute to be a placeholder. And here as a placeholder of this input field, I'm going to say enter the number. Okay, so before we continue furthermore, now let's try open up this page and let's see how will that look like. So let's open up our home page here actually. So on a home root route, just wait until this building process is completed. So whenever we change and modify our code within the Kobweb, then those changes will be immediately applied in our web browser as well. Okay, so now as you can see, we have two different elements. So we have a text and one input field that has a placeholder, enter the number. We can also go to the inspect page and see what kind of elements we are getting from that Kotlin code that we have written. So as you can see, we have one div element, and inside that div we have one span, which contains those style attributes that are automatically translated from our Kotlin modifier. Down below we have an input field that also has some modifiers that were translated into the style, into the CSS style, and it's a custom attribute placeholder as well. So that's how it looks like behind the scenes. Let's go back to our project. Next we need to add here one button. So let's call here a button composable function. As a text of our button, I'm going to call here a span text, and the actual text will say, for example, fetch. So as simple as that. Now let's specify here some modifiers to our buttons. So let's call here modifier and convert that to the attributes to satisfy this parameter actually. There we go. Now let's specify here the margin on the bottom to be also 16 pixels, for example. I'm going to copy this same thing, so font family and the font size. The font size here will be 16 in this case. And I'm going to add here on-click listener as well. Now, before we implement the logic to actually fetch that data and basically make a GET request to our own API, I want to create here one more text or element down below that will basically represent the actual data that we are going to fetch from our API. So below this input field, we're going to have one button, and whenever we press that button, we want to make a GET request to that same API that we have just created and retrieve those person objects and display them below this button, okay? Which is why below this button I want to add one more a composable function that will represent a text. So just go back, and below this button I'm going to call here a p composable function that actually represents a paragraph in HTML. So here as a text I'm going to just write the value that will represent an empty string for now, but later when we implement the logic you will see. Also I'm going to add here the attributes or the modifier, and here just specify the font family and the font size as well. Now below all of this code from here, I'm going to now create one function. So private suspend function with the name of fetch data. This function will have no parameters and it will return an API response object. So as you can see, we cannot access that API response because in our Gradle build file of our site module, we haven't implemented this common module in our JS main. So now we are currently working in our JS main, which means that we need to add here that same module as well. Now sync the project. Go back to our index page, and now this API response class will be available here as well. Perfect, so now let's import this API response. So this function will be called inside our buttons on-click listener, and whenever we click this button, we need to basically fetch the data from this input field and pass that data to our GET request. But to do that, we need to add here one ID property in our input field so that we can actually know from which field we want to retrieve the data from. So let's call the ID and specify the ID to be maybe, let's say, count input. And now in our function here, I'm going to call and actually create the variable named input text. I'm going to call here a document get element by ID, and as an ID, I'm going to specify that the same ID of our input field. And then I want to convert that as a HTML input element, and from that element I want to retrieve the value, okay? Now below that I'm going to create one more variable, number, and say if this input text is not empty, or actually is empty. So if it is empty, I'm going to here specify the value of this variable to be 0. So if this input text does not exist, then a default value for the number will be 0. Otherwise, I'm going to here call input text dot to integer, so that we can actually convert this input text to an integer value. Okay. And now below that I'm going to create one result variable, and I'm going to call here window.api. So this API property is used to actually make a request to our own API. So now let's call here try get function. So here there are a couple of different functions or HTTP protocols like the post, patch, delete, and so on. In this case, we want to make a get request. So there are two different versions of this get request function. So this second one basically contains a try and catch block inside this function, which means that if something bad happens, this function will return a null instead of throwing the exception. So let's call here try get, and as an API path, here I'm going to specify the same name of that endpoint. So let's say here get people, all in lowercase letters, then equal symbol, or sorry, question mark symbol, then count, the name of our parameter, equal to that same number that we are fetching or retrieving from our input field. Okay. And then I want to basically decode that result into a string. So let's here call a decode to string function. Perfect. And here as a return type of our function, we have an API response, which means that now this result string needs to be deserialized from that string to an API response object. So let's call here our JSON, which is a part of a Kotlin X serialization library. And let's call a decode from string function, okay? And now from this function, we need to pass this actual string that we want to deserialize into an API response object. So just type here result.toString, and there you go. So now our fetch data function is complete. The next thing, we need to now call this function from our onClick listener here. But before that, I'm going to also create here one more property or a variable with the name of API response text. I'm going to call here by remember to remember one mutable state, which will have a default value of an empty string. I'm going to also here create one scope. So remember coroutine scope, because within this onClick listener we need to call this suspend function. So let's call here scope.launch. Let's call here a fetch data function. And basically now what we need to do here, we need to create one variable API response that will hold that actual API response that we're going to fetch from our API. And now I want to create here one function that will be used to actually parse this API response as a text. As a text that we're going to pass to our paragraph down below to show to our users. So I'm going to create here one function which will be an extension function on an API response class, and that function will be inside our common package, because that function will also be used in our Android module. So let's here open up the common main. I'm going to create here a simple Kotlin file with the name of functions, and here let's create one extension function on API response class. That function will be called parse as a string. Okay, and it will return just a simple string. So here I'm going to say return when, and I'm going to here type this, which is referring to our API response object. So when this object is of a type of API response success, or first let's say idle, then when this API response is of a type of a success and of a type of error as well. So in each and every case here, I want to return one string value. So whenever we receive here a API response error, then I want to return a string which will refer to the error message of our error type. In the case when we actually have an idle API response, I just want to return an empty string. And in the case of when we actually receive a successful response, I want to call this actual API response, then a data object that represents a list of person objects, and I want to call here a join to string function. Okay, and as a separator, I'm going to add here /n, which is referring to basically one syntax that will be used to separate those items in this string in a new line, okay? And then within this function, I'm going to return one string value. So from here, I'm going to return something like a name, then the actual name of this person object, so something like that, and then the actual /, then age, then ith.age, so something like that. So whenever we receive a successful response, I want to basically convert that list of person objects into a single string, and that single string will be displayed on our page in this format that you can see right here. Alright, so now let's go back to our index page. And in our onClick listener here, I'm going to now set the value of this API response text. So just here call API response text equal to API response.parse as a string. Alright, and now this API response text will be actually used as a value of our paragraph down below. So like that. Okay, so now let's finally open up our web page and let's see whether now our front end is actually completed. Alright, so now here let's type some number, for example, let's say number 2, and let's press this fetch button. Immediately after that, we are going to receive here one response from our API in the form that we have defined in our parse as a text function, okay? So we have a name, then the actual name, and the actual age number. Okay, so here we have fetched two different person objects. The only thing that we need to do here, we need to also make the logic to actually separate those person objects in a different line, okay? And to do that, let's just go back to our project, go down below to our paragraph, and here I'm going to call API response text.split, and I'm going to split this actual string with that same separator that we have already defined in our parse as a string function, okay? So just copy this same separator, pass it right here, and then for each item, I'm going to call this text, and below this text, I'm going to also call one function br. So br is basically a HTML element which is used to make a break inside a text, okay? And now let's run this once again. Let's build our project. So here now set, for example, number 3, click fetch, and now as you can see, each and every person object is inside a separate line, okay? So everything here works perfectly fine. If we type here, for example, -1, we are going to receive that error message. So there we go. And everything works perfectly fine so far with our front end. There we go. So now we have completed both the front end and the back end of our Kotlin Multiplatform project. The last thing that we need to implement in our project is the Android application. And now goes the Android part. So let's close this index page. We don't need it at this point. We can close all of those files. There we go. And now let's create here a new module that will represent an Android application. So on top of our project, go to the right click and say a new module. I'm going to choose here phone and tablet. So our application here will be called just as simple as an Android app for now. But of course you can change that. So we are using Kotlin as a language. That's our package name and our module name as well. Click next. And if you're seeing this message saying that a selected activity template requires a project with Android X dependencies, it means that we need to do one more thing before we can actually create the new Android module. So let's click here cancel. Open up the Gradle properties file, and here add one more line of code, android.useAndroidX equal to true. So now sync the project, go to the new module, phone and tablet, so Android application, and now click next, and we will be able to select this empty activity template. So now press next, check this launcher activity option, and click finish. So now a new Android module will be created in our root of our directory. And immediately after we have created this Android module, new two plugins were actually inserted into our project level Gradle build file. So those are two plugins like the Android application and JetBrains Kotlin Android. Here we can also increase that version to 1.8.20. Now if you are seeing this error, we need to open up our settings Gradle file, and here I'm going to add two more repositories. So I'm going to add here Google repository and Maven Central as well. So now click try again. So now our project is building, and here as you can see this Android app module was automatically added and included in our settings Gradle as well. Let's also open up our Android app module and its Gradle build file as well. So here what we can do, we can also improve some of those dependencies as well. So for example, in this case, I don't need some of those dependencies for testing. Let's just remove them. I'm going to also set this Kotlin compiler extension version to maybe 1.4. Let's say maybe 6. Target SDK will be 34 and here 34 as well. And also I'm going to paste here a couple of more dependencies that we are going to need for our Android project, like for example a Kotlin X serialization library, as well as a retrofit library, because we're going to need that library to make a GET request to our server as well. Let's just change those versions. Paste those dependencies down below. So here as you can see, I have also implemented that common module because we're going to use those same model classes as well. Then the Kotlin X serialization library, a retrofit serialization converter, and it's OK HTTP as well. We can also improve and actually update our Java version to 17 here, and here as well. And we can also add that plugin, so we can call here alias, then libs plugins serialization plugin for our Kotlin X serialization. And now let's sing the project. So here if you're seeing this message that says is marked unstable with incubating, you can just add this annotation, suppress unstable API usage. And you can also add that right here. We can rename this packaging options to packaging, because as you can see here this was actually deprecated. So just call here packaging. And so far so good. Sing the project. And I'm going to now actually go to our Android app directory, and here I'm going to create a new Kotlin file with the name of a main screen. So in this main screen I'm going to now create a new composable function with the same name, and here I'm going to define how our actual screen will look like. Let's also remove everything from here from our main activity, so we don't need all those things. Just call here main screen composable function, and that's it. Close also all those Gradle build files from here. All right. So now I'm going to also create here a new file with the name of API service, and this Kotlin file will contain all necessary logic to actually create an instance of the retrofit and make a request to our API. So now I'm going to just paste some code and then I'm going to explain. So here I have created one singleton retrofit client, which basically contains the code, like the actual base URL to which we're going to make a GET request. In this case, that's a local host. So the reason why here I'm using a 10.0.2.2 is because that when using an Android emulator, a local host is accessed with this same value, okay? Then down below we have the content type. Down below we also have a retrofit property or a variable which is used to create our retrofit. So we have specified a base URL, the actual client, and the converter factory as well for our Kotlin X serialization. And this API service down below is actually used to create the instance of our retrofit and use our actual function that we have declared here in this API service, okay? So this interface has only one function, which is annotated with a get annotation, and it represents a function which will trigger a get request. The actual API endpoint is of course the API/getPeople, and the parameter that will be inside this get request is called count, as you can see, and the function or the actual response will be in a form of an API response model class. So now that we have that logic for making a GET request, now let's open up our main screen, and I'm going to create here the UI of our application. So here I'm going to also paste some code and then I'm going to explain. Okay, so this is now our main screen. So here we have a simple column and within that column we have of course the text field, which will be used to actually enter the number. We have specified here the keyboard options because we need only a number type of our keyboard. So the value is of course specified from this property, and whenever we type here something inside our field, then this same value will be updated as well. Below this text field we have one button which will trigger basically that GET request, and below our button we have a simple text which will hold the actual value or the response from our server. Now below that I'm going to now create a new function, so private suspend function with the name of fetch data. And this function will of course return the API response object. So API response, I'm going to call and actually create here a variable with the name of API service. And then from here, I'm going to call a retrofit client. So that's our object or a singleton. And I'm going to here call this API service. And of course, from this API service, I'm going to call that same one and call its function getResponse. Now this function should also contain one more parameter, count of an integer type, because our getRequest accepts that same parameter. So count equal to count. And now this fetch data function will be called inside a coroutine scope of our onClick listener of our button. So let's call here fetch data. I'm going to also create here API response object. So let's call here fetch data. And for the number, for this count, I'm going to specify that value. So that count value will be actually grabbed from our text field from this value property, okay? However, I'm going to also create here the logic to check whether that value is actually a numeric or not. So down below I'm going to create here one extension function on a string type. So is numeric, it will return a boolean value. So it will return true if this actual regex represents a number. I have also specified here this minus, which will also accept a negative values. So let's here specify a if block and say if this value dot is numeric. So if that's true, I'm going to return here that value and convert that value to an integer value. Otherwise, that value will be 0. And after we fetch that data, I'm going to now here update our API response text property. And I'm going to call here API response.parse as a string. So that's the same function that we are actually reusing across multiple different platforms here. And now I'm going to launch this application to see how will that actually work. Okay, so here it says that this Gradle plugin requires Java 17, but we are currently using Java 11. Let me just here try to update our Gradle properties to specify that Java home version. So here I have specified the location of my JDK 17. Now let's sync the project. Now let's run our application. Okay, so this error still persists. Let's open up the file, then settings. Choose down below build a Gradle, so build tools, Gradle. And let's choose here a Gradle JDK to be 17. So this one. Apply and click OK. So now let's try once again to launch this Android application. Okay, so now I think that our application will actually run. We can also remove this property from our Gradle properties file actually. So let's also remove that one. Okay, so now our application is up and running. Let's here type some random number. For example, let's say number 2, press fetch. Okay, so our application just crashed. Let's see what this is all about. Okay, so clear text communication is actually forbidden. We need to add one specific attribute in our Android manifest file. So in our application tag, just call uses clear text traffic and specify that value to true. Also, we can add here maybe an internet permission. So there it is. Now let's sync the project. Now let's run this application once again. Okay, so now let's enter here, for example, number 2, let's say, press fetch button. Okay, so our application just crashed once again. Let's see. Okay, so this error means that we need to actually now remove our application or uninstall our application and run it again. And now it should run just fine. So let's run this application all over again. type here number 2, let's say, press fetch, and there we go. So now we have successfully fetched that same data, but this time in our Android application. We can also type here, for example, -1. In that case, we should receive here an error message. So as you can see, everything here works fine as expected. We can also open up this website. So here, for example, type number 2, fetch. Here we can type any other number. So as you can see, now we have successfully created a Kotlin Multiplatform project that includes a backend, frontend, and the Android application as well. So if you have any questions about all of the things that we have done in this video, be sure to comment down below, and of course be sure to like this video, but only if you find it helpful. For this video, that will be all.
I'm a legend when they lay me down to rest.